Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another one of ResPublica's events, this time launching Virtuous, our Virtuous Banking report. First of all, congratulations for making it here to 1 Southwark Bridge. I suspect there are a number of people wandering lost and slightly disconsolate around Southwark Bridge Road in Elephant and Castle, but so you're to be congratulated already. It's with enormous pleasure to be launching this report, and I'd like to profoundly thank the Economic and Social Research Council for supporting this work, without whom it simply wouldn't have happened. You'll note that we at ResPublica can foretell the future. We accurately deigned from reading the runes that this was the ideal day to launch our report on Banker's Oath, and indeed so it proved. We woke up to the headlines about Lloyd's bank rigging, where people have apparently managed to rob the Bank of England, which will no doubt be stuff of film in the future. And we hear tomorrow that the FCA are talking about clawbacks for bonuses. One of the things that strikes me about bankers' scandals and the need for ethics is they're becoming a somewhat perennial affair. I remember reading yesterday, again in the FT, that the New York Fed is worried that bankers haven't learned the lessons from the previous crisis. And they administer such noble institutions as JP Morgan, Citigroup, Barclays, Goldman Sachs. And from the surveys they've done, they thought actually bankers and banking practices hadn't changed at all. Their response, and they have no stipulative or legislative authority, is a workshop in the fall. Now, I, along with you, think that in part that's the right way to go, but I doubt whether it will induce the change that we need and that the country desperately wants. So the aim of the report, which all of you have on your seats and which got great coverage this morning, I'm incredibly grateful to Sir Richard. You're up at 5:30, or now if that isn't dedication to banking standards, I don't know what is. But we've had wall-to-wall coverage, and from the highest levels, both the Conservative and the Labour Party, they're profoundly interested in the measures we propose. And what I think is interesting is where the industry is and where government and opposition, where the people are in dramatically different places, dramatically different. And I think unless we create some sort of a better bridge between those two places, what's going to happen is a surprising change that will be far more radical than anything the industry has predicted or indeed suspects. What we tried to do in this report is ask quite a simple question, and that is why, after so much regulation, do we still keep committing the same sort of crimes? And these aren't just legal crimes, though I hesitate to list the number of crimes that banks have been convicted of or admitted to. In fact, it's hard to think of crimes they haven't admitted to over the past decade. But it's not even that. It's even the sense of breaking not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And it goes on. And we regulate more, and it goes on more. And I suppose we at ResPublica feel regulation can never catch up, A, with the ingenuity of human beings who can always find a way around it, and B, regulation never really addresses the problem. And the problem is people who want to break the law anyway. People of what I think in the 19th century might have called bad character. I don't think we have a word for it now, which tells you how far we've got. But we've created a world in which people want to game rules. And what we believe is we want to create, and we need to create a world where people don't want to game rules, but they want to abide by rules and not just do rule following, but follow the rationale for why the rules were there in the first place. And we know from many other institutions that you can turn whole cultures and whole industries round. You can recover ethos, you can recover culture, and we know culture eats strategy for breakfast every single day. And yet we have failed to create the conditions for systemic culture change in our banking industry. Now, for me, banking is a noble profession. And it's not just a noble profession for the oft-mooted remark that macroeconomically you ensure the efficient allocation of capital, important as that is. It's noble because it creates the conditions for people to save. It creates the conditions for people to make provision against all of the things that can happen and do happen to you in life. And it creates the ability and the infrastructure for us to fund and support things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to fund and support. It's eminently necessary as part of a revived and whole economy. And yet we're still seen to be living at the fag end of a failed economic model, and we're still practicing it because people are still getting rich off it while other people are paying the price. And what we suggest in this report, which is broken down into various sections, are the ways in which we might try to reverse this trend and restore banking to its noble and proper role. The most important thing is, what's the purpose of banking? Why do we have banks? What are banks for? In my view, banks have a profound moral and social purpose. And that is securing the financial well-being and prosperity of individuals, businesses, and the communities they're in. The unbanked don't tend to do well. The unbanked tend to suffer more than those who work with financial infrastructure. It's quite simple, I think, to recover that sense of purpose. And I think in that sense, banks are not purely money-making and should not be purely money-making institutions. I'm not wholly persuaded by the idea they're public utilities, because not all public utilities serve the public good either. So we need to, I think, fashion a new purpose. And part of the idea of the banking oath that was reprinted in full on page 3 of the Times. And if any of you want to sign up, do let me know. We'll tweet you with approval. And I think things like the oath, when I don't for a moment think everybody will agree with that, and we welcome debate on whether that's a good idea or not, is what seems to me to be the problem is we never address the root cause. We never ask, how do you stop people of bad character having power and creating a culture that extends that behaviour to others? How do we get people of good character and good standing? How do we inculcate it in others? How do we teach it to people? If I said you want to bring up your children in a good culture with good standards of behaviour, none of you would demur. But if we talk about it for our employees or for our institutions, people smirk and smile and think, oh my goodness, that isn't possible. Yet we ask the same things of our schools. And people can do it. So we think things like the oath, things like social purpose, things like, as our report recommends, broadening and deepening the fiduciary duty of board members are all part of the key. We also think we need greater competition. One of the hallmarks of the last 10 years is under the guise of ever freer markets, we have seen ever greater economic concentration. There's a problem here. And the problem this creates is that what people want isn't on offer to them. The small, or the big choices rather, that we want, we're no longer able to make. We're no longer able to save properly. We're no longer able to support financial institutions that support our country or indeed our neighbourhood, because that choice isn't available to us. We have to realign our banking and financial institutions with the wider goods that everybody wants. And that's what we mean by greater competition. We don't just mean price, though of course we do also mean price. We mean competing on other standards. And that's why one of our recommendations is for banks to list customer satisfaction ratings and customer ratings generally as on their websites are part of what they compete for. So people can use their small choices to select for the big outcomes that they want. Finally, in terms of the report, we argue for increased market diversity. We don't think the shareholder PLC should be the only model, nor do we think cooperatives or mutuals should be the only mode of economic exchange. But we do think they have a better record and one that people generally support and wish there was more options like that present in the world. And I think that's what we're interested in. And we're not committed to old offers versus new offers. We understand online, we understand peer-to-peer. But we think all of them should subscribe to the general good. And as a thought, after doing various interviews today and talking with notable luminaries and listening to people in the debate, it's occurred to me that solicitors and doctors have general counsels. The Law Society regulates not just to the letter but to the spirit of the law, and it bars a solicitor from practicing, not just for breaking the law but also for violating ethical standards. The same with the General Medical Council. Banking has no such overarching institution. We have the FCA that I think's got off to a very good start, and congratulations to it in a number of ways, particularly in payday lending. It does have responsibility under the new senior persons regime, which is it's consulting on following the Parliamentary Committee on Banking Standards recommendations. And you have to be approved in order to operate. So we have a quasi-licensing regime. We have legislative in terms of examination bodies like the CII and the CISI and the CFA, but we don't have an overall body to regulate for the spirit as well as for the letter of the law. And it occurs to me, building on ResPublica's work, this is quite possibly where we should go. We might want to talk about things like a banking license, a license to operate, where if people violate, they are in essence forbidden from engaging in the trade anymore. After all, we do this legally when we prevent people we think are so beyond the pale they're not allowed to become company directors. And I think that the industry and organisations like mine and bodies and luminaries and intellects like Sir Richard, this is the debate we need to engage in. Because if we don't do something radical and transformative, this will continue, and we will get from either government or opposition, which may well soon be government, changes that won't be anything like the balanced package that we need. Because unless we create new levels of negotiation and recognition in the industry and between what people want, there simply won't be market permission to trade anymore. And that's what I can see coming down the road. So, without further ado, I would like to once more thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank the SRC for supporting this work. I'd like to thank all of our guests. And I'd like to thank Sir Richard Lambert, Chairman of the Banking Standards Committee, for doing the opening speech. Thank you very much. And a round of applause for Sir Richard, please.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Philip. And I would like to start by congratulating ResPublica on what I think is a really excellent report on virtuous banking. I think it will become required reading for banking leaders and policymakers, and its recommendations, I'm sure, will be high on the agenda of the new Banking Standards Review Council when it gets up and running around the end of this year. This is a subject I've been thinking and talking endlessly about over the last few months. So I would, if I may, like to spend my time today just giving my views on this publication, different parts of it, and just running through it, perhaps as a way for starting a debate with the panel and then with colleagues more generally. I've grouped my thoughts under three separate headings. One heading is absolutely brilliant. I think this is absolutely fantastic stuff, and it needs to be taken forward. And I will be there waving my flag as it goes forward. I'll highlight the ideas and recommendations that really hit the button for me. Some I think are still a bit rough around the edges, but the shape and direction seem to me to be spot on. The second category I'd like to talk about are needs more debate, or are debatable. And these are subjects that I would expect us all to want to talk about, for the new Banking Standards Review Council to think about seriously, but which may or may not be on the right track. And then the third category is, I think, needs a bit more work. By this, I mean ideas, proposals which have been raised in this document, which are important, but which I think need to just have a bit more attention before we get to the promised land. And one of these actually areas in particular covers an area where I know the three authors of this publication are brilliantly well placed to take the story forward and give us more ideas on. So let's start off with the brilliant category, my brilliant category anyway. The first recommendation in the report, as Phillip said, is that banks need to be much clearer about why they are in business, and that they need to define their sense of purpose. And that seems to me to be exactly right. In his report on what happened at Barclays, Anthony Saltz wrote that in the years leading up to the banking crisis, the bank's sense of purpose, those were the words he used, came to be its determination to maximise the return on equity over the short term. That was what it was in business for. And Barclays was by no means alone in that. You could spread that across the sector, and I think that was a prime explanation for the crisis in 2007-8. And we see, again, just the latest example has been mentioned in today's newspapers. Lloyd's traders did not personally benefit from manipulating the repo rates used to calculate fees on the Bank of England's liquidity scheme. They didn't get anything out of it for themselves, but they appear to have lived and worked in a culture where such behaviour did not, at least to those actually involved, seem particularly out of the ordinary in the name of profit maximisation. There's plenty of room for debate, I think, about what banks are for, the purposes of a bank. At one extreme you can say, well, are they there to maximise returns for shareholders? Is that why they exist? At the other extreme you say, well, no, they're public utilities. They are a utility function that are like a water company or an electricity company. I think the answer lies somewhere between these two extremes. Probably varies from institution to institution. In other words, the purpose of a big high street retail bank may well be rather different from that of a wholesale bank with little or no interface with the public. On this subject, Virtuous Banking, the report, draws its ideas from the three core principles it thinks the industry should strive to achieve and which should apply across the whole sector, which I think it's right in making that argument. And these three broad principles are to ensure systematic prudential security, to work for the prosperity of customers, to promote the responsible creation of value. Now, that sounds sensible, but I think there is actually a bit of room for debate about the conclusion that the report draws from these principles about the purpose of a bank, which the report says must be, quotes, to provide security and prosperity for its customers and to enable the flourishing of their communities in a manner that is responsible and creates shared values for society. I think I would have liked to have seen the word sustainable in there somewhere, just a sustainable over time. Banks have to make profits if they're to provide service to their customers over time. The level of profits will vary from institution to institution depending on how risky they are. But I think this is just quibbling. I think it's exactly right to say we should be debating what are banks for. So I congratulate you on that. A second area where I'm in complete agreement with the report in its discussion of ethics, ethos, and the need for virtuous banking. The arguments here is that ethics in all sectors of the economy are about promoting decisions and behaviours that are guided by values that go beyond a company's legal requirements, must, to be effective, apply to all aspects of business conduct. The report warns, I think, very sensibly against an approach that's based entirely on a compliance, a command and control, obedience philosophy, and argues that values must be embedded within banks such that they lead to actual shifts in behaviour, so people do things differently even when nobody's looking at them. And really this goes to the heart of what we're trying to get going in the Banking Standards Review Council, and I hope very much that we can work together on this going forward. And it picks up the themes made by Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, earlier this year, when he said, integrity can't be bought or regulated. Even with the best possible framework of codes, principles, compensation schemes and market discipline, financiers must constantly challenge themselves to the standards they uphold. And that's why he is actually supporting strongly this BSRC plan and keen for it to be taken forward. I think, as the report says, or implies, there clearly are limits to what can be achieved by regulation and the law. It seems to me to be saying, this report, that the question banks tend to ask themselves two questions. One is it profitable? And two is it legal? And the third question we're suggesting that should be posed is it the right thing to do? And that's something that can only be answered really by individual organisations, by the leaders of individual organisations, and by the kind of behaviours they expect from their colleagues. I'm all in favour of robust regulation, but as Roger Steare actually has argued somewhere else, at their worst, laws, regulations and red tape have a tendency to multiply because they remove our responsibility for deciding what's right. And that actually, in terms, is why the Financial Conduct Authority is supporting the work we're doing on this BSRC project, because they can see that the alternative to success here, the alternative to institutions taking their own grip on their moral principles and deciding what's right, the alternative to that is death by rule books. The other thing about regulation is that it does have a tendency to introduce complexity into the system, and complexity can be gamed. And there's no better example of this, actually, than just because I just read the book. I don't know if you've read Flash Boys by Michael Lewis. It's a totally brilliant book. And in it, we're told about how the SEC regulation on fixing share prices for the US securities markets created actually a gold mine for high-frequency traders, because the computers that the stock exchange had to do this were microseconds slower than the computers that the high-frequency traders were using, and that was big money. For me, the report strikes another strong chord when it argues that executive development in the banking sector has focused too much on training technical competencies and command and control management skills, and not this other good, soft stuff that we're talking about. I've actually felt this very strongly in my work over the last few months. For example, I've come across the idea that people really aren't encouraged within their sectors in the bank to look at the big picture. They are technically very competent in what they're asked to do. They complete their slice of the work technically, skillfully, and they chuck it over the fence to the next person down the line. And nobody really asks, what's the purpose? What's the outcome? What are we doing this for? And I think what is needed here, and this is what the report says, is a real shift in the culture of leadership to one that promotes moral purpose, character, challenge. More challenge is what we need. The report makes the case for what it calls a system of customer-led peer review, which it sees as a way of incentivizing banks to be more innovative with their products and services, and of encourage increased competition within the sector. And for exactly those reasons, we're proposing that the BSRC will be asking banks to report to the public under a series of headings, series of metrics covering their behaviours, competence, outcomes for customers. And I think it's very much on the same lines. If you've got ideas for what we're doing to make it more robust, we'd like to hear them, because it's actually quite difficult, but we'd like to hear from you on that. So let me turn. So there are lots of good stuff, and I haven't mentioned others. I won't go through the whole lot, but I think it's good. And I'll now talk about the things which I've labelled as debatable. As I've said, I'm sure that we will all want to consider these. For me, at least, they don't automatically ring a bell in the way the stuff I've so far mentioned does. And top of the list is the idea that has caught the headlines today, and that's the recommendation that all bankers should be required to swear a banker's oath. In the words of the report, we believe that if bankers were required to swear an oath akin to the Hippocratic oath that doctors affirm, this would signal a serious commitment from bankers towards the pursuit of greater professionalism. They do it in the Netherlands, why not do it in the UK? Here's my concern with this idea. It starts with the question that took up a lot of time in the discussions of the Parliamentary Banking Standards Commission, which is banking actually a profession? Can you compare it, as Phillip did in a way, with medicine, the law, accountancy? The Parliamentary Commission concluded that banking involves a very wide range of activities, lacks the large common core of learning, which is a feature of most professions. In its words, it's a long way from being an industry where professional duties to customers and to the integrity of the profession as a whole trump an individual's own behavioural incentives. I think that judgment by the Commission is correct, and I think that is the problem with a banker's oath. Several 100,000 people call themselves bankers in the UK. They have no common qualifications. Many of them have no qualifications at all. Most of them have little or no processes for self-discipline in the way that, say, the General Medical Council has. If bankers do want to take an oath, and I know that some senior bankers do want to take an oath, I say good luck to them. Let them get on with it, and let's encourage that. But speaking personally, I think that this should come at the end of the process rather than at the beginning, which is what's being suggested now. In other words, establish the robust framework that Phillip was talking about that's required for a professional body like the General Medical Council, and then think about imposing an oath. And in a sense, what we're doing with this Banking Standards Council is trying to do that. That was the mission set for us by the Parliamentary Commission. But I think we're putting the cart before the horse on the oath question. I think once you've got a robust system in place, I think that will take years, then you can move forward. If you do it the other way around, it could just be hot air. But that shouldn't be the end of the matter. Let's discuss it. Let's debate the idea some more. I think another area of the report which I think I probably overreacted to when I read it first. I think it's probably just me being a bit sort of whatever. But anyway, I've floated anyway, is I think it kind of failed quite to understand the extent to which norms in the banking sector have changed in the last few years. There's an argument in there which says if only bankers behaved like they did at home, you know, they're all like the rest of us, and went into work like with the values and standards that they have at home, then you know, things would be a lot better. And of course, you can't argue with that idea. Of course, it's true. But I think that what we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years, certainly in the run-up to the crisis, is that norms of behaviour in those long, prosperous years did shift in quite a lot of ways. And that what might have seemed unacceptable in year one had become standard practice by year 10. And that a culture of entitlement developed, which I think will be hard to shake. Warren Buffett used the words which I frequently quote because I like them, which are the 5 most dangerous words in business are everyone else is doing it. And hauling back on those attitudes will be complex, will take time, will need a different style of leadership, and won't be resolved simply by us all taking our home values into the workplace. So on to my final category of observations, which come under the heading I think this is really good, but I think it needs a bit more thought. So more work to be done by ResPublica going forward and by us at the Review Council. I think the first and most obvious area where I think the report needs a bit more push and a bit more whatever is that as presented today, it focuses very heavily on retail banking and gives little attention to the wholesale and investment banking businesses, and I think that's a weakness in the report. In a number of respects, I think the really big challenges when it comes to placing ethos and purpose at the heart of finance lies in the wholesale banking business. Of course, it's true that lots of things went wrong on the retail side, but I would suggest that those problems are much easier to fix than are the shortcomings that have shown up elsewhere. A lot of the problems in retail, after all, stemmed from top-down directions to the retail level to achieve sales targets that could only really be achieved by putting customers somewhere down the lists of the salesperson's priorities. And top-down directions can and are being changed. The Financial Conduct Authority reported a few months back that all the major high street banks have now changed their approach to sales targets for the better. They say there's still ways to go, but as it were, the instructions for the coalface have changed, and that appears to be having now effects on behaviours. I was interested to note just a couple of weeks ago, Accenture published a report on the UK consumers' trust, how far consumers trusted the bank, people they banked with. And the figures are lamentably low for consumer trust. 52% of consumers trust the banks that they leave their money with, which is really dreadful when you think about it, except when you realise that in 2012 the figure was 43%. So things have stabilised a bit and may even be picking up. So I think the retail side, I can see it's easy. I can see a way to getting that better, faster. I think that changing the wholesale behaviours won't simply be done by kind of messages from the top. This is likely to become all too depressingly apparent in the coming months as the foreign exchange saga starts to unfold. It's likely to show that bad things were going on well after the LIBOR scandal had been exposed. In these circumstances, I don't think it's really credible to suggest that the pathway to virtuous banking in the UK lies really only through the retail side. I think it needs to be broader than that. The second area where I suggest more work would be helpful comes in the discussion about the contribution diversity makes to the stability of the banking sector. This report makes a very strong and I think entirely authoritative case for the benefits to be derived from having broader types of ownership in our banks and a greater variety of structures within the British banking system. To take just one example, the economist Adam Posen, when he was working for the Monetary Policy Committee at the bank, produced an excellent paper, really good paper I thought, in which he argued that a big shortcoming of the UK banking system was that it didn't have a spare tyre for the provision of capital to non-financial businesses when the banking system itself sprang a leak. And he compared the UK with other rich countries like France, Germany, and the United States, and demonstrated, first of all, that banking business in this country is concentrated on a very small number of very big players, and that there are very few alternatives to the major banks if you want to raise money. Very few alternatives compared with Germany, France. So I think the report is absolutely right to say diversity is important, but I think, if I may say so, that you cop out. It's a bit of a cop-out, because you say, well, what we need to do to fix this is an immediate review by the Prudential Regulatory Authority about diversity in banking. And I think that's a job for a radical think tank, not for a regulator. It'll take 15 years to do it. We would like ResPublica, please, well in ahead of the election, to come up with a blueprint for a differently structured or a structured banking system that would address the problems which you've correctly identified, and you haven't given us the answers. That's a challenge anyway. On to my final suggestion for more work, and I think this is one where the authors of this report, David Lleweylln, Roger Steare and Jessica Trevelyan, have so much to contribute. They argue fantastically well the case for placing ethos and purpose at the heart of finance. But for my money, they don't give quite enough space to the practical processes that need to be undertaken to make this happen. We know you can't teach ethics as though it were a foreign language, but how best to share good practice and shared values across very large organisations? Who does it well? What can we learn from other industries? I know what doesn't work. For example, in my course of flogging around the banking sector in the last few months, I've seen lots of examples of online courses on ethics. And up it pops on the screen, this course on the evils of money laundering, you'll crack this in 30 minutes, and you look and say, I bet I could do that in 15. And you can, because the answers are always very obvious. That's not good enough. And I think it would be really helpful if a better way could get forward. And I know that the BSRC, when it gets up and running in the next few months, would love to hear your views on how to take this big picture that you articulate so well and actually get it working in the workplace in a practical way so that people get on with it. So to conclude, I think this is a stimulating piece of work that makes an important contribution to this debate. It doesn't have all the answers, but it's something I think we should all welcome. So let's talk some more. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sir Richard. It's great to have that level of engagement. We at ResPublica welcome debate. We don't want simple agreement. That isn't the way we make progress. And I think I take your criticisms. I think you're right about wholesale. That itself, in terms of the practice we need, would need another whole tranche of work. And we recognise that we were focusing mainly on retail. And we're open to doing exactly that. While you're with us, I'd like to just address, and I think it's wonderful you don't agree with us on the oath, because I think the argument that banking isn't a profession and that it covers such a huge range is a very good argument. But it needs to be a profession, is what I would say. Yeah. And if you look at how you get culture change, you don't get culture change by small practices. You get culture change by big visions that people buy into. And part of that big kind of moral vision is, I think, evinced and carried by things like the oath. Obviously, if you think of the British Army, one of the most effective kind of value inculcating organisations we have. One of the most remarkable things about the British Army is they recruit people from everywhere, from every walk of life, and they form them into a cohesive unit by precisely talking about vision and by creating that sense of shared purpose at the outset. They don't do it at the end, they do it at the outset, and then they build out from that. And I would respectfully differ from you on this, and I think that that's the only way to build things together. And unless we do that, what we are going to have is empty practices, empty rule following, empty formulation. And so I would be quite tempted, just from knowledge of what works elsewhere and from human anthropology, to actually begin at the beginning. And I would probably press you on that. And I wonder what your sense would be as to what's the most efficient and effective way to get the culture change we both want.
I'll start off just a bit by saying, the difference between the British Army and the banking sector is that they're
both institutions.
They're both I don't think the banking sector is an institution. I think the banking sector is a complex web of different institutions with tens of thousands of people doing very different things and not feeling shared values and are not feeling as if you are if you're in the army, that you have a stake in the values of the person you're working with and on the front line with, because if you don't, you might end up dead. I think there's a really strong glue in the army that there isn't in the banking sector. I'm also slightly and I may be wrong on this, but my impression is that the Harvard oath, which and the MBA oath, which started off with such zip and verve 2 or 3 years ago, has run into the ground because after a bit people forget about these things and move on. And I think in a way, in fact, the thing that worries me about this whole process, the whole thing that I'm engaged on in this banking council thing, is that if it fails, it's worse than if it had never started. You see what I mean? And I think that's the case with an oath. If you have all bankers taking an oath and it's just words, and it's seen within 6 months to be flawed, I think you're in a worse place than you were before they took the oath. So my feeling is, let's think about the other things that you've got in your report, which I think are so important. Let's have banks say, this is why Barclays, this is what I'm in business for. This is what I'm seeking to achieve. These are the stakeholders I'm seeking to support. And this is why I'm in business. Let's have the banks reporting on their performance under the headings that you mentioned in the report about customer values and all those good things, and outcomes and training and qualifications and things like that. Let's build over time a professional ethos that begins to feel a bit like a real profession. And then at that point, you're ready for an oath. I just think if you do it at the beginning, you might just end up...
just one little question, and I'll ask colleagues on the panel to come in. Do you think then, and I take your point, that it's so disparate, do you think that banking ought to become more like a profession, like doctors, like lawyers? If we forget how we get there, which is a different question, do you think it ought to become more like a profession?
I think that there is a strong case for thinking that wouldn't it be good if bankers, when going about their business, had in their heads the notion that they might wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, what I've just done is going to embarrass me in front of my peers.
Yes.
That's what I think. In a sense, you might think that's what a professional thing is, that you have an obligation over and above your immediate employer and your immediate sort of quarterly earnings thing. I think that would be desirable, and that is the way towards a profession. But I do think that takes time. But what shouldn't take time, or anything like that much time, is professional behaviour. And I think there's a difference between being, a profession, which I think will take a long time for banking to be a profession, but I think that professional behaviour is what everybody has a right to expect now.
Thank you so much. What I'm going to do is just very quickly, just one question from each of the panellists to Sir Richard, since he's here and obviously is.
I'm staying for a bit as well.
That's great. I just. Alison, Group Director at Nationwide, just one quick question to Sir Richard from you, perhaps, on his initial speech and reaction to the report.
One of the comments I would agree with most in terms of the I come from the retail banking sector of the building society, and addressing the challenge within retail and addressing the challenge across the whole sector in terms of wholesale investment banking I absolutely agree. Do you think we've made the progress that we need to do as a sector, as an industry, in terms of addressing that across the spectrum of banking activity?
Across the whole piece? No, I think there's more. There's a good bit more to be done. I think that on the retail side, a lot has changed for the better, and we'll have to see how that flows through in terms of customer satisfaction in the coming months and years, and that will be where your report will be helpful in making people think in that direction. I think on the wholesale side, my impression is that the leadership has changed has changed itself and is sending out different messages and is struggling to achieve change. But in these very large organisations, several levels down, there are people who have spent their whole careers behaving in a particular way and have done very well out of behaving in that way, and it'll take a bit of time for that to change.
Okay. Very quickly again, Paul Chisnall, Executive Director at the British Banking Association. Paul?
Well, as Sir Richard knows, the BBA is a strong advocate of the new council. In our evidence to the Parliamentary Select Committee, the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards, we very much advocated the setting up of a new body to oversee improvements in professional standards in banking. And I very much think that the creation of that council and the work that it will undertake going forward will be a big part of the answer. I guess my question would be whether Sir Richard thinks that the report has given enough emphasis to other initiatives that are taking place, whether since the general election or since the recommendation of the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards. I'm thinking here of the division of the FSA into a regulator that includes a regulator designated to look after conduct. I'm thinking of the shake-up of the approved persons regime. You mentioned a consultation shortly on clawback. Of course, we're expecting consultation very shortly on the introduction of the senior persons regime, the certification regime, the introduction of banking standards rules. We have expanded criminal sanctions. We're very much tightening up the whole process of regulatory enforcement. I think there's lots of parts of the jigsaw here. And I guess my question would be, has this report given enough emphasis to that? And, perhaps a question to the authors, when they say the Dutch have introduced this, and this is the answer, have they actually undertaken a review of what the other measures are that have been put in place in the Netherlands?
What appealed to me in this report was that it didn't go into great detail about the regulatory changes that have occurred, which are, as you say, very significant, and we haven't really felt the impact of them yet. In fact, we won't really know what the certified persons regime or the senior manager regime is until the end of the year, and I'm sure it is intended to hold people to account in a way that hasn't happened before. But what I think is good about their work is that it says that's not enough, and that it's critically important to have people working at every level of a bank or any other business that are thinking about what's right and what standards they wish themselves to have for themselves, and the notions. And it's really difficult because, old geezer remark coming up. Kind of brace yourself. This is an old geezer's comment coming. It used to be possible at any rate. People would say, well, in small investment banks where people stayed for a bit, he would say that's not what, Warburgs would say, we don't do that around here. I'm terribly sorry, we don't do that business. There was a time when Goldman Sachs refused to do a hostile takeover bid because they thought that wasn't consistent with its ethic. I mean, that was fine, but that was then and now is now. We need to find, we won't go back to partnerships, we won't go back to any of this old stuff from the past, but we need to find a framework, a set of tools, a sort of ethic, which people ask that third question, which is, it's not just is it legal and is it profitable, but is it the right thing to do? And that's what this lot, I think, working away on.
Thank you very much. David Lleweylln, Professor of Money and Banking, that's a great title, at Loughborough University. David.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Could I just raise the issue of the interface between regulation on the one hand and all the various other means on the other? I should declare an interest. I'm chairman of the Banking Stakeholder Group of the European Banking Authority, therefore I'm very much in the world of regulation, about which I have extreme doubts that whether we're going down the right road at all. I sometimes ask in our board meetings, if regulation is the answer, what is the question? And I'm not sure that the regulators have defined the question correctly. Because what they tend to focus on are processes. What we are arguing in our report is that misses the point. What we are really after is, if you like, underlying culture and ethos of the organisation. So what I think we need to do, and whether your council would be interested in this, I think we need to think very, very carefully about the interface between regulation on the one hand and the various other, if you like, self or collective self-regulation on the other. Frankly, I think this is the biggest challenge, because my prediction is, and I don't speak for the EBA, my prediction is, unless we get the necessary change in culture and attitude right, perhaps along the lines of our recommendations, but many others as well, if we don't get that fundamental change right, two things will happen. One, we'll have yet more complex, detailed, extensive regulation. Secondly, that regulation will extend to reducing your powers, that there will be very substantial restrictions on what banks can do. And I think we have to ask the regulator the same question, Richard, as we raised in the report: what is banking for? There is a very, very big danger, in my view, that regulation will regulate away the functions of banks. And that is something that we must avoid. And therefore, sorry, it's a long-winded question, but how do we tackle that interface between the alternative, on the one hand, regulation, on the other hand, the various other mechanisms?
Thank you, David. Well, I think that's a jolly complex question. I hope that it's possible that the role of this new body that we're proposing would complement that of the regulator, that it would sit alongside it. For example, we had lots of healthy discussions with the FCA, who are being constructive about all this. It's clear that, for me, it's clear that this new body is not in the regulatory business. That's not what it's there for. And it's clear that the powers which a regulator has, statutory regulator, are not appropriate for something like this. So, for example, it would be inappropriate, it seems to me, for the FCA to share information with this body, because that's privileged information. There are data which are in the public domain, anonymised data, which would be useful for this group when it writes, as it will do every year, how's the British banking sector doing, how things getting on or not, but it shouldn't go beyond that. But I think that complementary activities are possible and desirable are when it comes to thinking of areas where voluntary standards would make a difference. Yes. When it comes to areas where it would be helpful, for the reasons that the ResPublica report points out, for banks to disclose how they are doing under various headings in terms of customer outcomes and satisfaction and so on. I think if it comes to a sort of clash, then failure will follow for this outfit. The regulator will carry on. So I hope that the relationship between the regulator and this body will be separate, independent, but sort of informally constructive. The regulator would be prepared to give guidance to this group about areas where it made sense for them to look and where it made sense not to trample over their ground. But you're right to say it's a challenging point.
Thank you so much. And Roger Steare, Visiting Professor, Cass Business School.
Thank you, Philip. I'd just like to make an observation, which is if you'd like to open your wallet and purses and take out a £20 note, by the way, we're not doing a whip round for the next report, but if you have a look at it under words Bank of England, it says, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £20. On the back of a $20 bill, it'll say, "In God we trust." So with respect, the entire banking system is based on solemn promises, in other words, oaths. The FCA principles, the PRA principles, are a set of principles which can be interpreted as an oath. And in fact, the entire credit system on which our economy rests lies not on rules and processes, but on the trust that we have in each other. And I would go further to say that every employee of every corporation is, through the board, subject to Section 172 of the Companies Act, which sets out a range of duties for directors, which you can themselves interpret as components of a series of oaths and promises. So in a way, my observation is we already have a whole series of oaths and promises within the banking sector, some of which are observed a lot of the time, some of which are not observed. But I don't see the problem in actually having this debate and moving forward to, if you like, a formalisation, a summary of what promises we make when we are not only in banking but in business generally. So my observation is that this oath is seeking to formalise a whole series of other promises we make when we run a bank, when we work in a bank, when we run a business or a public sector institution. The whole system is based on those promises.
Yeah, I think that an important point to make is the Bank of England has been going for several hundred years and people trust it. They just trust it. There's the story I always like is, when Saddam Hussein was running Iraq, the Saddam dinar relative to the dollar fell by about 95% in the space of 5 years. In the northern part of Iraq, Kurdish Iraq, the dinar was not accepted. They were exchanging bits of paper with signatures on it. People trusted that. Yeah. It kept pace with the dollar because they trusted it. Saddam's promises were worthless. The Kurds' promises were not worthless, and so people trusted it. And I think that's where I slightly, I think it's good to have a debate about oath, but that's why I'm on the side of the fence that I'm on. It's all about trust.
And I thank greatly Sir Richard for letting us have this debate and for precisely opening it up. I particularly enjoyed Roger's remarks because, I think I would like to deal with people who've taken oaths. I don't know about you, because what works, I think, in trade between people is some sort of statement before and during that you're both going to try and abide by, as it were, the implicit contract within any explicit contract. But I leave that aside. I don't want to continue. There are many other points in the report. What I now want to address is go through specific points in the report that individual authors have either written or that people would like to comment on. And first of that, I would like to ask Alison Robb, Group Director, Nationwide Building Society, to talk about their mutual approach to banking standards.
Thank you.
Alison.
Thank you, Philip. We've heard from Richard about the sheer and understandable scepticism about whether the sector can change, and I've absolutely no doubt that for the Council to be successful, this is one of the biggest challenges. We absolutely are committed to the Council, and people will often say to Nationwide and to our board, why is the Building Society you so keen to be involved at the heart of the work? And that's because, coming back to a point that Richard made, because we work in a sector where only 52% of the public trust us, and that's not acceptable. We need to be in a position whereby we are trusted across the industry to a standard that banks would have been a generation ago. But we believe that we're incredibly well placed to play a role. We support the comments in the report about the diversity of models in the sector. And I don't just mean diversity in terms of ownership structures, but also diversity in terms of size and scale. There are many small financial institutions, particularly building societies, that operate very successfully, that are trusted in their local communities. So for us, size and scale is just as important as overall ownership structure. But within the ownership structure, there's absolutely no doubt that the fact that we are owned by the people that we do business with every day makes a difference. And when I look back over the last very challenging period that we've been through, the fact that our board have been able to take decisions that have had a long-term implication because we haven't had a share price trading that we're all watching has absolutely, I truly believe, been fundamental to some of the successes that we've had. Our board continued to invest incredibly heavily throughout the crisis because we weren't under the same pressure to deliver a profit figure year in, year out that some of our banking competitors have had. And so we fundamentally believe that a diversity of ownership structure, that people have an opportunity to undertake a core part of their daily life, their banking services, with a range of different providers of their choosing, is absolutely vital to the success and to the to how we do get trust back into financial services.
Thanks so much for that, Alison. And again, it reflects back to the reason you have so many small members. On my Twitter feed this morning, they were talking about Cumberland Builders Society that apparently is loved by people in that locale. And it's that, what I think is interesting about those institutions is they allow the big choices people want to make to be made through the small actions they do, which I think is structurally important. Paul, once again, Paul Chisnall, Executive Director at the BBA. You were talking about your approach to banking standards.
So as I've said, I've given you part of the answer. We became an avid correspondent, I think, with the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards. I think we were second only to the regulatory authorities in the amount of evidence that we put in. And a big part of that evidence was advocating the setting up of a professional standards body very much within the industry space to work with banks at a leadership level on raising professional standards. And I think that is quite distinct from what we could see as you've got the role of the regulator, and indeed there's improvements that could be made there. You had lots of, and there are lots of, institutes and professional bodies and educational bodies working with individuals, but the gap that we saw was a body within the industry space that would work with the senior leadership with banks on their culture, on their conduct. And I think we stick to the view that we think there's a great deal of promise in terms of the council. And I think that if you think that we only put that idea forward 18 months ago, and it's only 12 months since the Parliamentary Commission recognised the value of such a body in its recommendations. We've then had the hard work of Sir Richard, and we've reached the point, I think, in a relatively short period of time where the Governor of the Bank of England is to chair a nominations committee to take that body forward. So I think that's a big part of the answer. Of course, it was only one small part of the recommendations of the Parliamentary Commission. They identified something like 80 or 90 measures that they thought needed taking forward to improve professional standards in banking, and I think each has a part to play. So I think it's a multifaceted problem, and I think there are many areas where we just have to look at the suggestions that have been made and take them forward.
And I think ResPublica, from the thrust of the report, would deeply welcome the idea of the industry-led banking standards council that you propose, because it's exactly that level of leadership that we require. The interesting question is the general public and the impact that could have in terms of outward facing.
Oh, I agree with that entirely, and I think I should add that although we strongly advocated the setting up of a banking standards council, we're also clear that in governance terms it had to be independent of the industry and it had to be independent of the BBA. And the strength, I think, of such a council working with leadership within the banks is that it's then got the means of either holding banks at a senior level to account or actually facilitating the means by which those banks are held publicly to account. And that's a big part of it.
Thank you so much. David.
Yeah, thank you very much. Clearly, there are many ways in which the retail financial services industry has, in a sense, failed the consumer. And please don't believe I'm bank knocking. This is not my job at all. But nevertheless, there are serious problems. And this has led to a serious reduction in consumer welfare in terms of financial services. And all of these problems, I think, lead to one overriding issue, and that is trust and confidence. And that is why we spend a lot of time in our report arguing the issues of trust and confidence, because if you just go back to first principles, trust and confidence is actually needed in finance far more than in most other industries for two fairly obvious reasons. One is the nature of financial products. They can be very complex. But secondly, the limited ability of consumers to make rational choices, simply because of that complexity. Does the consumer really understand all of the issues involved? So for those reasons, trust and confidence is very serious. Now, this erosion of trust and confidence has led to a very serious outcome. It's quite clear, isn't it, that if the consumer unwisely buys or is sold a totally inappropriate product, there is a clear loss of welfare. Now, that is obvious, and it is also measurable. Equally serious, however, is the loss of consumer welfare if the consumer does not buy good products, simply because there is a lack of trust and confidence. And I would suggest to you that this loss of welfare due to lack of confidence and consumers not buying good and appropriate products is probably just as serious as the headline measures that we get of the costs of the consumer buying inappropriate product. Just one final issue on diversity, because it has been mentioned several times, and we do give a great deal of emphasis in our report to this issue of diversity, and hopefully to erode the monoculture, almost monoculture, not quite, the almost monoculture of the shareholder value model in banking and financial service. We argue strongly, I think, that there is a public policy interest in enhancing diversity in the structure of the financial system. Now, please, just lest there be any doubt about this, so, if there are any masochists who are reading the report, we are not knocking the shareholder value model. We are not saying that the shareholder value model is wicked, produces bad outcomes, or what. That's not our point. What we are arguing is that a financial system which is diverse in its structure in various ways, including ownership, governance arrangements, is likely to be more competitive, more stable, less risky, and give more benefits to the consumer through wider choice. So we do emphasize a great deal. The UK, funnily enough, I've studied this issue in various other countries with a couple of projects with the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels. The UK is fairly unique in Europe in this respect, in that the share of what we call stakeholder value firms is much, much lower in the UK than virtually anywhere else that we've studied in Europe. Secondly, that diversity has actually declined very, very sharply in the UK, largely because of the conversion of the 10 largest mutuals, building societies. Now you say 10 is not very many. It's actually 72% of the industry of the time. Whereas elsewhere in Europe, the degree of diversity has actually increased over time. And if there's anyone interested, I can give you references to various data models about this. And finally, I would argue very strongly that conversions that have taken place in the UK, which by law are not possible in other European countries, have been, in my view, unambiguously bad, in the sense that they have reduced choice. We know there's a lot of evidence that a thriving stakeholder value model, such as mutuals, actually has the effect of eroding the pricing power of shareholder value banks in that country. The higher the proportion of total business conducted by stakeholder value banks, the lower is the pricing policy of shareholder value banks. So for all of those reasons, we strongly advocate diversity, but it's not knocking the shareholder value model.
There you have a total welfare argument for diversity based on that has direct correlates in consumer welfare, lower prices. Sure. So fantastic. Roger.
Thank you, Philip. First of all, I'd like to echo Philip's thanks to the Economic and Social Research Council, to my colleagues who authored this report, and to the panel here, and to all of you today for engaging so passionately with this. I've got a couple of comments, additional comments to make about, first of all, about the failure of rules-based regimes, and secondly, how that impacts on practical processes for implementation. I don't think there's any public disagreement now amongst policymakers and regulators that an emphasis on rules-based regulation effectively has as much effect as having a rules-based regime with 2-year-olds, or should I even say 15-year-olds. It's for moral infants. It assumes that those who create such rules are A, omniscient, and B, omnipotent. And if you want to see what that looks like, look at Syria and North Korea today, and Iraq yesterday. More pervasive and more destructive, I would say, than the external regulatory environment are the internal rules and processes within these banks. I speak about that from first-hand experience at working with their senior leadership groups. We live in a society which is a democracy and has social justice. The corporation is a product of medieval and feudal thinking. It is not democratic, and it does not have social justice at its core. Therefore, the behaviours I see from good people who are called bankers is perverted, in my view and my experience, and through the research, by those medieval and feudal performance management targets and other fear-inducing systems which give rise to many of the dysfunctional behaviours we've seen, not just within the PPI story in retail banking, but in interest rate swaps mis-selling, in business banking, and in the cynical manipulation of indices in wholesale banking. As Richard has already said, people who manipulated LIBOR did not benefit directly from that activity. Perhaps they were afraid of losing their jobs if they did not reach their profit targets. Therefore, I think that I would like to see a debate about how we can understand the formation of human character in society, in families, in friendships, and see how that can be better nurtured within the workplace. This doesn't just apply to the banking sector, it applies to business generally. Part of the research that I've been doing with colleagues has demonstrated very clearly that the basic character and decision-making preferences of people who are good people in society shift significantly when they come to work. If anyone's interested in that research and data, I'm very happy to share it with you. But my comment, my recommendation is that not only do we need diversity in ownership models, we need to look carefully at the dissonance between the political philosophy of our society and the social and political architecture of the businesses that dominate our society.
Thank you very much, Roger. I love the idea of looking at the formation of human character. The interesting thing about morality is it's not natural. It doesn't come along with being born, it's taught. And I think one of the most remarkable things in the workplace, when we so desperately need to be moral, we have very poor standards of teaching and inculcation and practice. But anyway, let's throw it open. I'm sure many of you have questions. Do we have roving microphones? We do indeed. Let me take, what I'd like you to do is if you could say your name and then give your question. I'm going to take them in 2 blocks of 4. So if you can make it pithy. I don't want a statement, a question, please. And we'll let the panel choose. First one by you, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Phillips. I'm in the House of Lords. I'm hugely relieved that you don't endorse the current nonsense that more and more law equals more and more good. I mean, it's almost a reverse ratio. But I do want to ask Richard and the panel about the role of enforcement of the laws we've got, because one thing that nobody's mentioned, but which seems to me to be vastly important in terms of public confidence, is to see not a single senior banker put behind bars over the last 5 years, during which time thousands of our citizens have been put behind bars for stealing 20 quid's worth of stuff from Tesco's. And the dissonance in terms of values between what is done in this square mile and what is done outside it, it seems to me to be doing the most profound damage, the likes of which we have not begun to appreciate.
Thank you very much. Lovely, short, pithy question. Abby, the gentleman in glasses just there.
Greg Forge from Finance Watch. Fully endorse the comments on purpose. I'd like to ask about accountability and just note that, well, banks produce a lot of useful services. The essential services that they produce are really public goods. I'm thinking about deposit taking, the payment systems, and the creation of credit to supply money to the real economy. But there's no accountability for the provision of those about how or why they're provided. I'd like to ask, do any of the panel members think that we have something to learn from the German system, where public banks have, forgive my pronunciation, öffentlicher Auftrag, which is a public service principle? Do we have something to learn from them?
Lovely, thank you so much. Have the gentleman there.
Hi, William Claxton Smith here in a personal capacity, although most of my career is spent in asset management, and that's what's behind my question. I haven't read the whole of the report, but I've read the work which underlies the recommendation 4, which is about accountability to shareholders and owners. And one thing I would question is the banking industry is, I think, uniquely unreliant upon its owners, shareholders, for its capital. And while I'm sure elsewhere in the report you do cover accountability to depositors, I just wondered about whether you see a role for bond holders and cocoa holders and all those other people in holding banks to account.
Thank you so much. And one more question. Can we have the gentleman, the lady here, please, at the front? Thank you.
Hello, it's Rebecca Pritchard from Virtuous Bank. My question was really in relation to the bank that is largely government-owned, RBS. I know we've talked about how diversity could improve things, but I just guess given the large stake that we all have in RBS, is there not a case for making them a bit more of a leader in this area? I expect there's a tension from the government's perspective between increasing the share price and realizing a return as quickly as possible, but it just strikes me that this would be a golden opportunity.
Lovely, thank you. So let me start from inside out. Roger, which of those questions would you like to do? And repeat the question if you would.
Okay, I'm going to go with Andrew Phillip's question/observation. The question was, we already have a criminal justice system, and yet we haven't seen any senior bankers behind bars. And in my last discussion with the FCA, I, as well as being tough on too many rules, I'm tough on there not being enough enforcement of the existing rules. And in fact, if you look at every mis-selling scandal, you can define each of those in terms of fraud. If you look at the definition of fraud at on the website of the Serious Fraud Office, the definition has not really changed for hundreds of years, which is basically the gaining of financial advantage through deception. And every one of the scandals we've seen could have been prosecuted, or certainly could have been looked at under the terms of criminal fraud. And my overall view is we need fewer rules, but we need to enforce them at the personal level. I can't remember who it was, but a judge in the US in the 30s basically said the trouble with a corporation is that it has no body to incarcerate nor soul to condemn to hell. And the only people who have a conscience in the corporation are the leaders themselves. So I would like to see increased personal liability for criminal activity within corporations generally.
Thank you very much. Paul, if you could repeat the question.
Well, I wouldn't really like to pick out an individual question because I thought they were all really good questions. So I'm sure the video can work with that. I mean, I don't think we need more law, but I do think we need better law. You can't just keep adding and adding to statutes, and perhaps what we need to do is think about what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then trying to improve that. I do think enforcement is part of the answer. And I do think that actually at the time that some of these events unfolded, perhaps the powers that were there weren't actually exercised, and that's something that I think is a learning lesson. I do think that the recommendations of the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards around enhancing individual responsibility are part of the answer. And I do think that the whole idea of, I mean, this is what Andrew Tyree called the Orient Express defence, where we could all see the body, but who was responsible. And, you know, the idea is to tighten up the approved persons regime so that we have identified senior individuals. There will then be certified post-reporting into them. And if something's gone wrong, there'll actually be a very clear chain of command so that enforcement action can be taken. I do, however, think that a greater emphasis on ethics is part of the answer as well. And I think it just boils down to something quite simple, and that is, what is it that constitutes a good decision? And it's not just about profit, it's not just about it's legal, there's something much more fundamental than that. And of course, shareholders and senior creditors have a role to play as well. And again, I think we'll see that unfold, again, as part of some of the changes taken on the financial stability side, where very clearly the bank's performance is of relevance to those senior creditors.
Thank you very much indeed. Alison.
Again, really like Paul, so not specifically one question, but perhaps picking up the point around capital and access to capital. There's absolutely no doubt. Again, if we come back to the point around diversity, if I look at the sector broadly, regulation, certainly for building societies and mutuals, has insisted that we have loss-absorbing capital, rightly so. And mutuals' only access to loss-absorbing capital until very recently is in their retained earnings. But over the last 12 months, we've been able to launch a new capital instrument with institutional investors, but whereby those institutional investors only have one vote collectively. So we've created an instrument which meets all of the regulatory requirements, but also allows the ownership of the business to remain in the hands of the members. So there's absolutely no doubt that, again, across the sector, it's vital that we look for constructive and innovative ways to go about meeting the challenges that the economy gives us, but also that the regulator gives us. And I think back to David's point earlier, if we look to what we've seen in Europe and the maintenance of a more diverse model, it's because we've seen across Europe a willingness to seek the new, to seek the innovative, and to maintain different structures, whilst also protecting the financial stability. And if we look in Germany in particular, a real diversity of approach to provision of financial services that's clearly underpinned a less stressful crisis for Germany.
Lovely. David.
Yes. Could I link two of the questions on accountability? I think, first of all, there are two aspects of this. I think there is internal accountability and external accountability. There's the internal governance arrangements. Are loan officers, other officers properly monitored? What are the incentive structures that they are given through bonus arrangements, etc.? And are the rules of the game that are established internally, are they satisfactorily monitored and sanctioned when things go wrong? So there is that internal aspect. There is also, of course, the external, and we normally say that a firm, whether it be a financial firm or whatever, is ultimately accountable to its shareholders. Sorry, its owners, who may or may not be shareholders. And what I would actually say there is that there is a very major difference between a mutual, cooperative, credit union or whatever, and a shareholder value bank. And the difference is that in the shareholder value bank, the owner is the shareholder, and there is a division between the owner and the customer. And you may then get conflicts of interest between those two. For instance, it's fairly well established that under some circumstances, in a shareholder value model, there is an incentive for the shareholder, under some circumstances, to go for high risk, because the upside gain is potentially infinite, the bottom side loss is limited. In the case of a mutual, however, the customer and the owner are one and the same person. In general, I know there are exceptions. And therefore, I think the potential for conflict of interest between the owner, the shareholder if you like, and the customer is less in a mutual than in a shareholder value bank, which is one reason in favour of diversity within the system. So I stress, we're not arguing for all financial firms to be mutual, but we are after a diversity in the governance arrangements and in the accountability arrangements within the financial sector.
Thank you. I think another problem with the shareholder model is owners don't really own it. They're far too passive, and it's the managers who game it. But leaving that aside, Richard.
Well, if I could pick up two things. One is the shareholder one, and I think that it's ridiculous to say that shareholders own banks. They've got sort of 5% of the balance sheet, and they're often selling well below book value. Shares in banks are speculative options, basically. They're not ownership counters. Yeah. And therefore, I think that there should be attention should be given, as you suggest, to the rights and obligations of the bondholders as well, because that's what seems to me to be what the reality of the situation is. And the second point, really to Andrew's point, I think it's his responsibility to Andrew's point about getting more bank bosses locked up. You should read the history of the South Sea bubble, I'm sure you have. And after the bubble burst, the members of the House of Lords recommended that the directors of the South Sea Company should be put into a sack with adders and thrown into the Thames. What are you doing? Why are you hanging around?
Fascinating remarks there from Richard on actually I wasn't going to mention that, on the idea of the banking shares are speculative and it's the bondholders who really own the banks.